stations that are subscribing as well, particularly Rumble. I want to welcome aboard, well, let me just get my notes here, Hans von Spakovsky. He is Manager of Election Law Reform Initiative and Senior Legal Fellow at the Mies Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Hans is the co-author, along with John Fund of the Wall Street Journal, of the new book, Our Broken Elections: How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. Hans, I can't think of a topic a subject more topical right now. I will just state going forward that I want to be careful because this is YouTube, and in a sense, the results of the last election have caused such discussion to be subject to censorship, and people that I know have lost their programs on YouTube because of it. That's why I'm also live streaming on Rumble as a backup. And that is because the last election of 2020, I don't think it's too far off a limb to say that it exposed serious flaws in our electoral system. Could you please give us a synopsis in terms of how those flaws, what we learned from that election in terms of electoral flaws, election flaws?
Look, well, keep in mind, our book, Our Broken Elections, yeah, there's a lot in it about last year's election, but it's about our election system in general. You know, both how folks register to vote, and then how they vote, how the votes are counted. And John and I have a lot of experience in this. We've been working on this issue for decades.
Yes.
And we have, unfortunately, serious problems throughout our entire election administration. We've had many of these problems for years. Last year's election simply, I think, helped highlight many of them. And it's everything from the fact that many states don't have basic security protocols in place. New York and California, for example, don't require any ID whatsoever when people vote. States, many of them, don't do a good job of maintaining the accuracy of their voter registration rolls. They're simply not very good at taking people off who've died or moved away. They don't do very much to find people who are registered in other states as well as their own states. I mean, it's just one problem after another like that that could cause problems, particularly when elections are close. And anyone who doubts that, just think back not that long ago. Remember the 9th congressional district race in North Carolina in 2018 was overturned. Overturned because of absentee ballot fraud, and they had to hold a new election. And what we do in this book is document all of these various problems in great detail, with a lot of evidence to support it. And then, frankly, at the end, what we do in our final chapter is make recommendations. These are common sense, straightforward recommendations on how to fix the vulnerabilities that currently exist in the system.
Wonderful. And I want to get into that, but let's do a little more background on this. The other element that I think needs to be brought up, and again, I want to be careful here, is issues around electronic voting. These were issues that were raised by my own U.S. Senator in Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren. She isn't talking about it now, but a couple of years ago, she pointed out that in an article in Time magazine that all of the electronic voting should be stopped completely, and that she said our elections need to be as secure as, quote, Fort Knox, unquote, and that there were major problems with the voting. The same article said that voting machines were online in many cases. Lester Holt of CBS did a whole special on that, where they had computer experts come in and talk about voting machines online and how dangerous that is, how votes could be manipulated that way. Again, this isn't me talking. These were major people in our government and in our media saying this. And I think that we need to get a handle on that. But you mentioned the fact that some states don't have the kind of security around voter ID. It seems pretty obvious that the states you mentioned tend to be the so-called blue states. And it became an issue, I think, in 2012, when basically it seemed like everyone was on board, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, in terms of developing a system by which there could be voter ID that would not be burdensome to the voter, that would not be costly at all. In fact, Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm was one of the leaders in that movement at the time. And then all of a sudden along comes this group called the Brennan Center for Constitutional Law, which claimed that voter ID was racist, that somehow Black people could not get voter ID, which I think in itself is racist because Black people can do it just like white people. It's not, we all have means of having ID. We have to do it to rent an apartment or even buy a 6-pack of beer, but yet they raised this. And I think it was quite convenient as a way to reduce such methods as gaining simple voter ID. And I think that there was a motivation there. What say you?
Well, in fact, no, I think unfortunately that's true. Look, election reform and fixing the vulnerabilities of the system used to be a bipartisan thing.
Yeah.
I mean, just look back to 2005 when former Democratic President Jimmy Carter and former Republican Secretary of State James Baker actually formed a commission on federal election reform. They issued a long report making all kinds of recommendations. One of them that was that, yeah, of course we need ID when people vote, the same for so many other aspects of everyday life. And there was pretty much bipartisan support for that. Unfortunately, that has divided. It's no longer there. Let me say, all of the claims that ID laws are suppression of votes are completely false.
Of course.
We know this because, look, the first voter ID laws were actually passed in 2005, 2006, after litigation was filed unsuccessfully to stop them. In Indiana and Georgia, for example, the first ID laws were in place for the 2008 election.
Mm-hmm.
So we've now got more than a decade's worth of data, turnout data. And the turnout data clearly shows that voter ID requirements do not affect individuals, no matter what their race or ethnic background, or even their socioeconomic status. It doesn't keep people from voting. And in particular, Charles, this is because, as you know, every single state that's put in an ID requirement has also put in a provision saying, look, if you don't already have an ID, we'll provide you, the state will, one for free.
Exactly.
And that's why ID laws are overwhelmingly supported by the American people. The constituents of folks on the progressive left don't agree with the leadership there. The support for voter ID runs across all political lines. It doesn't matter whether folks are Republicans, Democrats, or independents. And it also doesn't matter what their race or ethnicity is. They overwhelmingly support voter ID as a common sense reform. But that's just one of the changes that need to be made to protect the right of all voters, I don't care which party they support, to be able to vote and to make sure that their vote is counted and will be used in the election to determine who the winner is.
Indeed. Okay, my guest is Hans von Spakovsky. The book is Are Broken Elections? How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. Hans, also, the charge more recently in recent years is that somehow things like voter ID and laws that make sure that people on the voting rolls are in fact alive and living in the state that they're voting, that these things constitute, quote, voter suppression, when in fact the opposite is the case. Voter suppression happens when a bad vote suppresses a registered vote. If you vote, if voter A goes and votes and they're registered to vote, and then voter B is a vote that comes out of something else, they're not registered, we don't know who they are, there's no chain of command, that is voter suppression, because the voter who had voted legitimately, their vote was effectively canceled and suppressed by the false vote. And I think we need to really drive home that point. Now,
the American people understand that. They understand that very well. Again, the research that John Fund and I have done and the polling shows that voters, access is important, but voters want both access and security. Yes, they want to be able to vote, but they don't want their vote canceled out by, not just fraud, but errors and mistakes made by election officials. And again, unfortunately, those who oppose election reforms, they don't want that. All they care about is access without any security, and the American people disagree with that.
Right. So, the only logical explanation that I could come up with regard to why this, kind of the liberal establishment is fighting to stop voter ID is because they want to steal elections. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Now, in this last election, of course, we realized in the aftermath, and it was too late, that it is the state legislators who have the sole and indeed the plenary power to make election laws in their states.
Right.
And that's Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And yet, in the name of the pandemic emergency, you had state governors, state secretaries of states across the country, particularly in the so-called battleground states, and judges, and even unelected people making laws and circumventing the laws that existed that had been passed by the state legislators. And those laws tended to liberalize the identification of votes. And most troubling, they were involved with the mailing out of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of unsolicited ballots. And recent canvassing in certain areas, particularly Maricopa County, Arizona, which I think was a reflection of what happened nationally, show that some of those, or many of those mailed out ballots were sent to, vacant parking lots. And some people who were registered to vote might get 10 ballots. And in the case of California, University of Santa Barbara there were 400 ballots that were sent there and mailed back, and there was nobody living there at the time due to the pandemic. So this idea of sending out unsolicited ballots, even here in Massachusetts, they did it. In Massachusetts, when it comes to elections, it's pretty conservative. Don't you think that's problematic? And don't you think that might have had something to do with the election?
Look, we have a whole chapter in our book dedicated to the problems with absentee or mail-in ballot. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that long ago that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement issued a report on absentee ballots after a long series of absentee ballot fraud cases in the state of Florida. And they called absentee ballots the tool of choice of vote thieves. And that's because they're the only kind of ballot that is voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. And it makes them the most of all ballots subject to being stolen, not delivered, forged, altered. And plus, it makes voters subject to pressure, coercion, and intimidation in their homes. Because campaign staffers, candidates, and others can show up at their homes and try to pressure them to vote the ballot a particular way, something that can't happen inside a polling place, where that kind of electioneering is prohibited. And the push for those opponents of election reform for vote harvesting, what they call vote harvesting, what we call vote trafficking, would simply enhance that risk. For folks who don't know what that means, look, in states where you can vote with an absentee ballot, you can mail it back, which of course brings all kinds of risks that the Postal Service might not deliver it in time. You can mail it back, you can hand deliver it, a member of your family can hand deliver it. Usually a designated caregiver can deliver it also for you. But what many are pushing for is to allow any third-party stranger to show up at someone's door and pick up and deliver that ballot. That means that you're basically wanting to give candidates, campaign staffers, party activists, and political consultants. Yeah, all of whom have a stake in the outcome of the election. You're saying you want them to be able to handle voters' ballots. That is a very, very bad idea and a very risky idea that endangers the security and integrity of the election process.
Well, there were widespread reports, including an investigation by a sheriff in Racine County, Wisconsin, which indicates that people who are bundling votes, who are harvesting votes, if you will, and as you said, it's supposed to be one person who knows the voter who can't make it to the poll, delivering the vote. That in Wisconsin and apparently in Las Vegas, they were literally setting up tables in parks and taking people right off, who are walking by, like like it was like you're selling hot dogs and saying, come on over. And they were filling out ballots. And in the case of Racine, Wisconsin, according to the sheriff, you had people going into nursing homes and harvesting ballots from people who maybe had passed away or who had dementia or who were not functional to vote. And that came about as an investigation because a woman discovered that her mother had voted even though she had passed away. So
that needs to be investigated, and anyone who was involved in that needs to be prosecuted. By the way, that is one of the other problems with absentee ballots. There are numerous cases in a database that we maintain at the Heritage Foundation, where I work when I'm not writing books with John Fund, of individuals taking advantage of the elderly and those in nursing homes, assisted living centers, and others to basically vote their ballots for them, and that is something that needs to be investigated when there's evidence of it, and the folks who engage in that need to be prosecuted.
Indeed, and I don't think I'm going too far into troubled territory here when I note, and I think this is public record, that in the last election, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife wrote a check for $420 million to give to these two organizations, very partisan organizations, that train people to do just this, to go out and to harvest votes, particularly in Folsom County, in Atlanta, Fulton County, Atlanta. And to basically, this is another issue. They were manning polling places and manning the counting rooms where votes are counted. Now, it seems to me that we don't have much accountability, or we don't know that much about what goes on in those rooms. And we do find out after the last election that they kept counting and counting and counting in Detroit, and they were putting up pizza boxes in the window to keep people from seeing what was going on with the counting. How do we find out, or how do we monitor or regulate the activity of counting absentee ballots? Is there a way that we can ensure that, it's kind of like cashiers in a 7-Eleven. They always have two people behind the counter just to keep each other honest. One person kind of looks at what the other person's doing. Shouldn't there be two people in the counting room, one of whom would be a Republican and the other a Democrat, to look and inspect these ballots?
Well, that is supposed to be and should be the rule in every state. But you bring up an important topic, which is transparency is a fundamental key to fair and secure elections. That's why the U.S. State Department, for example, sends teams of Americans abroad as observers in fledgling democracies everywhere. Yeah. Every state has laws providing that candidates and political parties have the right to have observers in every location where voting and ballot counting is going on. What happened in places like Detroit and Philadelphia was local election officials there basically broke the law. They did not comply with the law. They either threw the observers out so they couldn't see anything, or put them so far back that they couldn't actually effectively observe what was happening. And what needs to happen with that is that, first of all, the election officials engaged in that kind of behavior need to be disciplined or terminated. And second, states need to do what Texas did recently. Part of its election reform package that it finally passed and that the governor signed into law was a strengthening of their poll observer statute, making it basically putting in punishments if an election official throws out an election observer without the grounds to do so. And the only grounds to do so are if an observer is actually interfering with a voter and the election process. They're simply standing there and observing. Election officials have no right to throw them out of the polls, and yet that's apparently what was happening in many places during the 2020 election. That does need to be stopped, and the way to do that is for state legislatures to strengthen their poll watcher laws.
I seem to remember Jimmy Carter going to Nicaragua to observe the election.
Oh, yes.
We should have sent him to Philadelphia this last time. But,
Jimmy Carter's been on many observer missions. He made that a a dedicated purpose of his presidential center when he left the presidency.
We should find out what he thinks now. But, I still wonder what happens in the counting rooms, though, with absentee ballots. Now, here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, but that's the place where observers also
Okay.
need to be legally entitled to be, so they can watch the opening of the absentee ballots, the verification process, hopefully the state has one, and the actual counting of the ballots. If a state does not allow observers in there when that is happening, that is something that is a fundamental flaw in that state and should be fixed immediately.
Well, I think it's safe to say that probably the main reason why Glenn Youngkin and all of the other Republicans won in Virginia was because of an effort by the Republican National Committee and the Youngkin campaign. And also, we should give credit to Stephen K. Bannon and his War Room Pandemic podcast. He happens to be a resident of Virginia. And the result was that they fielded thousands of people to man the voting places and the counting rooms, and that every district was manned and observed. Every vote was watched just about and inspected by both sides. And they had a staff of attorneys on call in case there was any improprieties. They could respond within an hour. And that's why they won. They put in place this model that would really completely reduce, if not actually eliminate, the potential of voter fraud. Now, the Republican committee knows damn well what happened in 2020. They won't say it publicly, but the point is, whatever happened, we now know going forward that there can be this model and that it can be set up in every state, especially as we approach the midterm elections 12 months from now.
Well, what I'll say about that is that, look, I think it's important, frankly, no matter which political party you support,
right,
that all of the political parties and the candidates have observers in every single aspect of the voter registration, voting, and counting of ballot process. It's that kind of transparency that will ensure that we don't have problems, frankly, caused by anybody. And I do have to say that, again, if you look at the database that the Heritage Foundation maintains of proven voter fraud cases, election fraud is a bipartisan thing. We have cases.
Right.
We have cases in our database of both Democrats committing fraud, Republicans committing fraud, and while sometimes people think, well, it's only when one party tries to steal from another. No, there are plenty of cases where it's people within the same party stealing from others, and the fraud occurs actually in primary elections.
That's right. And there's certainly Republican voter fraud. I mean, it isn't a partisan issue. The question is whether or not we're going to have a system in place. And also, there has to be a means to stop judges from stepping in and making laws from the bench when, again, that is the prerogative of the state legislators.
Right.
And secretaries of state. I mean, there was a case in Michigan where Secretary of State Benson, I would argue a fairly corrupt official, made a law saying that signatures would no longer be needed to be checked for absentee ballots. They could just scribble and that's enough. And that overrode a state law that was passed by the state legislature. And it was eventually thrown out by a state judge. Of course, it was too late by the time they did that. So, if there's a learning event, I mean, if we can learn something from this last election, it is that the state legislator has that power and no one else, according to the U.S. Constitution. And we have to make sure that our state legislators understand the nature of their office and that they need to step up and conduct that function.
Oh, I agree. And look, one of the recommendations we make, and like I said, the last chapter of our book is a whole list of recommendations.
Please,
one of the one of the recommendations that John and I make is that state legislatures need to be sure that they have laws in place that give both the state legislature and any registered voter standing the ability to go to court against any election officials that refuse to comply with the state election laws passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. They need to be able to go to court And a judge should have, frankly, almost no discretion from issuing an order telling an election official, like a Secretary of State, no, you can't just simply waive state law. You have to comply with it.
I also think it's important for states' legislators to conduct forensic audits if they feel that there was a problem, as was the case in North Carolina, where they did find such significant problems they had to hold an election again. I also would say that the Maricopa County audit was a shining example of how an audit should be done. It's probably the most comprehensive audit ever done. And it should be done according to the rules of that state legislature. I find it curious that these audits are so heavily resisted by the Democratic Party. I mean, if the election was so pristine and so perfect, they should welcome the audit. They should just say, let's do it so we can finally put all these sort of questions and controversies to rest. But they've hired staffs of lawyers to stop the audits. State legislators have the right to do the audits. They have no other authority has the right to interfere.
Oh no, again, I agree with that. Look, audit, the opposition to this is really bizarre. Audits are routine in the business world.
Of course.
As you know, every publicly held company has to undergo yearly audits. It's so routine, certainly nobody questions that. And if you made proposals to say, companies in the business world should not have to undergo audits, in fact, there's something wrong with it, everybody would think you're crazy. And the same thing needs to happen in the election area. Every state ought to require audits after every election. You don't have to do every county in a state, but you should do something like Texas. Again, their election reform bill that is now law, they put in a provision requiring that 4 counties after every election, picked at random, undergo an in-depth audit. And an audit does not mean simply recounting the votes, because simply recounting the ballots does not tell you whether all of the ballots.
You could be recounting bad votes. It doesn't tell you.
Exactly right. So a forensic audit not only looks at the counting of the votes, but it also looks at the equipment to make sure it was functioning properly. But it also looks at the voter registration list to ensure that all of the individuals who voted in the last election were actually alive. They actually lived where they claim to live. They're not, they don't live in another state. I mean, it's those kind of parts of a very in-depth audit that ought to be done everywhere, and everyone should welcome it. Look, an audit is not going to overturn a prior election, but what it is going to do is identify problems that you can then remedy to make sure that those problems don't occur in a future election, and that's very important.
I might only take issue with you into noting that it very well may overturn an election if they find a significant level of impropriety, and if they find things like votes have been cast that are not canvassed properly and they're not detectable. And in some cases, like as in Maricopa, they found that votes that were cast were not counted.
Well, that would depend, Charles, that would depend on one thing. And that is, keep in mind that in every state, they have time limits under which litigation could be filed contesting the outcome of an election. I mean, if you conducted an audit and that time limit had not passed, well, then, possibly, a lawsuit could be filed contesting the results of the election. But an audit conducted 6 months after an election, the results, no matter what they are, you can't use them to overturn the election, because in every state, the time limit to contest the outcome of that prior election will already have passed.
Okay. I mean, look, I'm not a lawyer, and I feel like I don't want to go too deep in those waters. I trust other lawyers, but I don't know if that's quite so much confirmed or it's been tested. I think that that an election can be decertified if they find significant fraud. I think there was a Supreme Court case, I think it was the Throckmorton back in the 19th century, which said that the proof of fraud at a certain level vitiates everything else. And perhaps there could be other cases cited. I don't know if that's been tested, but if an audit, I think, does expose such problems, I mean, it very well could do that. But I don't know. I suppose that would have to be tested. So, Hans, just to wrap up, I want you to just again describe some of the remedies that you list. I know that John Fund wrote a book about this years ago, probably 10 years ago. And I remember interviewing him then, and it was extraordinary. This isn't a new issue.
No, it's not.
It goes back to the founding of the Republic. I mean, it's nothing new. I mean,
no, it's not. In fact, John Fund and I wrote a book together in 2012 on
I
this
think that's
issue.
the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, called Who's Counting, and
Right.
we made many recommendations there. Look, the recommendations that we make cover everything from requiring an ID to vote, both in person and absentee, verifying the citizenship of people who are registered to vote, tying in statewide voter registration lists to other databases to ensure their accuracy. That means comparing them, for example, on a monthly basis with the state's Department of Vital Records to find people who've died or still registered, tying it into the state's DMV system so that when someone changes their residence on their driver's license, that's automatically updated to the voter registration list. Same thing with state welfare agencies. Absentee ballots, there's a whole series of recommendations there, including, for example, requiring a witness signature, requiring an ID with an absentee ballot, and in relation to something we talked about just earlier, very quickly, outlawing all private funding and private grants going to election officials. What you were talking about with Mark Zuckerberg, or what we call Zuckerbucks, because obviously private funding should not be going to election officials. It raises all kinds of ethical and conflict of interest concerns, and government offices should not be used by candidates or those supporting particular candidates as basically their get out the vote campaign. And so that's just one of the many recommendations in our final chapter.
Well, we're talking about voter integrity here, and I hope that's something that any and all of us can get behind, because if we don't uphold the principle of one man, one vote, then we're not going to be a free society. Hans, how has your book been received by, for lack of a better term, the mainstream media?
Well, they're not paying much attention to it, but a lot of other folks have. Mark Levin, I think the #1 rated talk show host in the country, has praised he has praised the book. So have folks like Ted Cruz and Senator Mike Lee of Utah. So it's getting a good reception of people who are really concerned about election integrity.
Well, it speaks volumes that the liberal media has not paid attention. These are the same people that paid no attention to the thousands of affidavits that went out the last time around either. They've not done their job. They have, I've heard a good friend of mine tell me, oh, well, I'm not supportive of democratic institutions by questioning the election. I mean, this has been a talking point. And I'm like, well, actually, that is what a democratic institution is. An institution that you constantly question and investigate. And our media didn't do the job they're supposed to do by being independent and being dispassionate in their questioning of elections. So you're not talking about democratic institutions here. You're talking about aristocratic institutions where people don't question their mechanisms. I mean, so, we are calling for democratic institutions that we keep honest by doing things like writing your book, Hans. So I want to thank you for doing the work you're doing.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. The book is available at Amazon Books and other venues. And that book, remind me of the title here.
Yeah, it's Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. John Fund and Hans von Spakovsky.
All right, Hans, thanks again for joining me this afternoon.